was the time for the closing of the gate prayer, which is a Jewish prayer. He too lowered the shutters and locked the gates, and I returned with all the worshippers home. Amichai's poem is a monologue which was never fulfilled. The shutters were lowered, the gates locked, and the poet, who went home with the worshippers, could not explain why he is there. But this inner speech is itself incomplete. The poem points to Amichai's trauma, but it does not articulate it. There is no mention what is the trauma, there is only indication. Darwish also underscores the inability of words to express his trauma, but insists on composing one word, homeland. We'll see now. So I'm not going to read everything, only the parts which are in bold. I come from there, that's the name of the poem. I come from there and I have memories. Born as mortals are, I have a mother and a house with many windows. I have brothers, friends, and a prison cell with a cold window. I'm jumping now. I learned all the words worthy of the court of blood, so that I could break the rule. I learned all the words and broke them up to make a single word, homeland. I will ask Rick now to speak about the poetry of Yehuda Hamakai. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Achia, for that beautiful introduction. I'd like to speak about Yehuda Hamakai and the way that I knew him and his work and interacted with him over the years. I met Hamakai when I was an aspiring poet myself in the mid-1990s. And we spent a weekend together in Philadelphia when he came in to do a reading at a conference. And I was assigned to chauffeur him and his wife Hannah around. Well, I went to meet them at the 30th Street train station, and he's lugging a huge beat up from the train platform up the stairs. I ran down a few steps, and I said to him, Yehuda, let me help you. And he said, Lo, kol echad tzarich lishchov et shalo. Everyone has to schlep, everyone has to lug their own baggage. And that's the way he was. He was a very down-to-earth person, warm, with a good sense of humor. And I wanted to give everyone a sense of him as a person, but I also think it's appropriate to tell this story because we all have suffered. We all have our own baggage and have experienced our own traumas. It might be the death of a parent at a young age, or being exiled from home because of a war, or diagnosed with cancer, or losing one's home in a cyclone or tornado. And we each have to find a way to deal with it and try to come to terms with it. And for Hamakai, poetry was one way to try to understand the traumas that he had experienced. He was born in Würzburg, Germany in 1924, and he was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home, and his whole family left for Palestine in 1935 during the early rumblings of the Nazi era. As a teenager, he left his orthodoxy behind for many reasons. And he ended up fighting in numerous wars, first in the British Army in Cairo against the Germans, and then in many of Israel's wars. He turned to poetry and he won numerous prizes, and his work was eventually translated into more than 35 languages. And he told the Paris Review in 1992, he said, I've often said that I consider myself a post-cynical humanist. Maybe now, after so much horror, so many shattered ideals, we can start anew, now that we're well armored for disappointment. I think my sense of history and God, even if I am against history and God, is very Jewish. I think this is why my poems are sometimes taught in religious schools. It's an ancient Jewish idea to fight with God, to scream out against God. Over the last 10 years or so, I've been working on an artist's book, The Hamakai Windows. It's a collection of 18 of Hamakai's poems, each with a window theme, overlaid with collaged images and much more. And in doing research for the book, I went up to Yale University to see Hamakai's papers and the original poems. And I have a few quotes from Hamakai that I would like to share with everyone and that I think will add to our discussion about language and crisis. So this is Hamakai's words. Poetry is a release because it helps me locate my pain and transform it into words. It is my instinctive way of touching a wound. It also organizes the world for me. It puts some order into the ongoing chaos. It gives me something to hold on to, meaning, if you like. I started writing poetry using my words to come to terms with my life's extremes and heal myself and go on living. I strongly believe that art has to heal and comfort and not just present the cruel reality of our modern life in Israel and the world over. And lastly, just an amazing quote to me. This is from an interview that he did in the Israeli daily Haaretz in 1965. He said, "A poem is like a lullaby that you sing in order to calm yourself." A poem is like a lullaby that you sing in order to calm yourself. I would have been completely lost. Especially love in Hamakai's poetry are two things. First is his wry sense of humor, and second, his quarrel with God. He's always arguing with God about the way the world has been created. And I selected a poem to read today entitled Yom Kippur that reflects both of those elements, his humor and his argument with God. Now, Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the Jewish New Year, when one fasts and prays for forgiveness. And in describing the death of the persona's mother, of all things, Hamakai pokes fun at bureaucracy. And then he turns more serious and voices his argument with God about how so much in his world, including the language itself, has been shattered. Yom Kippur by Yehuda Hamakai. Yom Kippur without my father and without my mother is not Yom Kippur. From the blessing of their hands upon my head, only the tremor remains, like the tremor of a motor that has not stopped, even after their death. My mother died just 5 years ago. She is still caught up in the bureaucratic process between the heavenly offices above and the paperwork below. My father, who died long ago, has already been resurrected in other places, but not in my place. Yom Kippur without my father and without my mother is not Yom Kippur. Therefore I eat in order to remember, and drink in order not to forget, and arrange the vows and classify the oaths by time and degree. By day we cried out, "Forgive us," and in the evening we cried out, "Open the gates of heaven for us." But I say, forget for our sake, forget us, leave us be at the time of the locking of the gates, for day is done. The last rays of sunlight are shattered in the synagogue's stained glass window. The sunlight is not shattered, we are shattered. The word shattered is shattered. Hamakai also had a big influence on me as a poet. And I don't have his sense of humor or incredible gift of metaphor, but I do share his philosophy about art and his argument with God. And I also like to play with and reinterpret Hebrew texts. This first poem of mine that I'll read is called 32 Degrees Fahrenheit, or maybe with all the listeners in India, it should be called 0 degrees Celsius, but 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Like Gogol's threadbare overcoat, stitched together from pronouns, nouns, verbs, language consoles us in the dark. Of course, there is no comparison between birdsong, the words birdsong, and the song of a catbird, between dimming light and the ebbing light of June days, between the word lilac and its scent. But words keep us warm on frigid nights in this galaxy where water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And how many other ways are there anyway to keep warm? And this other poem that I'd like to read is called The Lord is My Shepherd, a kind of spin-off of the famous Psalm 23 in the Bible. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall want to know one day why God made hurricanes and floods and rested on the seventh day. I shall want to know one day why God sent down famine and disease and rested on the seventh day. I shall want to know one day why God rested on the seventh day, but did not grant us any rest. And I'd like to close with some advice that Hamakai told me that weekend in Philadelphia. He really was like a father to me, a little bit of father figure. I had been a war reporter in Israel and had trouble trying to figure out how to deal with all those experiences. He said, Rick, look, love won't save you from war, but it can help you deal with the pain. Poetry can help too. Words help me to regain a balance in my life. You have to accept the good with the bad. That's the way life is. Thank you.
I have to unmute me. Hi. Okay. Rick, thank you so much for sharing your beautiful poetry and painful at the same time. Maybe that's beautiful poetry. And your experiences with Yehuda Hamakai. We are now moving on to Aishwarya Iyer. And Aishwarya, I would like to pose a question about the poetry of Paul Celan. It seems that Celan's crisis of language is even more acute, so to speak, if one can even compare this kind of thing, due to his choice, if it was a choice, to continue to write in German after he survived the Holocaust. His situation is similar, but more complicated, I guess, than other minor authors or writers who write in the language of the major. Deleuze and Guattari analyzed the unique situation of Kafka, a Jew who wrote in German. And they argued that his minor strategy was to break language from within, so to speak. How do you describe the relation of Celan with German or with language in general?
Thanks, Achia, and everyone else for for inviting me to this session. I firstly feel extremely overwhelmed to be speaking about a poet such as Paul Celan, and I will do my best, in sort of saying the little that I find appropriate in this context. Yes, I think that when Rick read out those beautiful lines from Hamakai, as well as his experiences with Hamakai, it becomes clear that language itself, especially in the context of violence, language itself becomes a question. It's no longer something that you can return to um, as a matter of faith or as reliability, or even as a as a carrier of truth. There's something, language itself has gotten corrupted, not just at the level of meaning, but even at the level of spirit itself. And so in that sense, for Celan to write in German, I'm not sure how much of it was, yes, it was a choice, but it was a choice in a very deeply spiritual sense. I mean, for him, German was a mother tongue. It was the language of his mother, and his mother was, shot by by Germans in one of the sort of internment camps in Romania. So for him to write in German was also in a way to continue resisting, because if he wouldn't write in German, it would actually be, it would really be a way of sort of, copying out. So for him, writing in German, in the language, in the very language which was actually used to to build the entire sort of framework, paraphernalia, of the Holocaust, was, I think, a very daring and also very arduous and sort of spiritually dissipating, I would say, task for Celan. But I think he does this because he truly believes, as that there is that quote from the speech that he makes in um, um, when he receives the Buchner prize, which is that language alone. Sorry, I can't find the quote right now, but it was language alone that he could really hold on to. Everything else had really fallen apart. Everything else had been destroyed. Everything else was, sort of had disintegrated. And this alone was really the space that, he could hold on to in order to, sort of register his complaint. But I think in his case, it is not merely the fact of registering a complaint, but also really trying to purify language from within. And so for him, of course, I think of him really as a poet of negation, but not negation in the sense of, rejecting life, or, saying no to life, or saying no to the world, but really, holding the moment of negation, sort of freezing, or rather slowing down the moment of negation in time, so that from the very moment of negation itself emerges the possibility of viewing what language really could be, in its perfection. And so, so when language has become a field of deception, lies, falsehood, authenticity, for him, holding sort of the negation becomes a way of, or holding the moment of negation itself becomes a way of groping towards the truth, or groping towards what he cannot see as the truth, but, it's sort of like a search, a groping towards the truth. Also for him, language is not an instrument of representing reality, or, providing a world picture, providing a picture of reality, providing a picture of the self, providing a picture of the other. Rather, it is a field within which one, or, the poet, or even the reader, or the human being after the Holocaust, it's really a field within which human beings should, or might, discover themselves as relation, as Buber would put it, as a relation between, I and thou, as a relation between, selves. So, and not really sort of like, his poetry is not really a poetry of a subject who is, very sort of stably grounded in speech. For him, language itself has become unstable. Its capacity to name things in the world has become unstable. Its its capacity to point at the differences between things, and the, and to point at the difference between good and bad, good and evil. All of that has really been called into question. So for Salan is really working, within that kind of matrix. I'm thinking also of the question of, again, writing in German. Anne Carson, in her sort of, early book, which is called Economy of the Unlost, she writes about Salan and says, Salan is a poet who uses language as if he were always translating. So she says he had to develop an outside relationship with the language he had once been inside. So of course he grew up with German. Strangely enough, he grew up with German as a mother tongue, but he really has to, rediscover his relationship to German after all that happens. And so, from the state of being an insider, he really has to, sort of push himself to a different space, to the outside. She says he had to reinvent German on the screen of itself by treating his native tongue as a foreign language to be translated into German. I think of, for instance, South Asian poets. Some of us here, I know Maz is in the audience as well. Those of us who write in, in English, we are, I feel, a little bit in sort of the opposite condition, which is that, we are born into, some of us, I'm not saying all of us, but some of us, many of us, we are either born or reared into a language which is really for us on the outside. And we are, I'm talking here about English, and so we try to sort of make a home or make an inside. We translate ourselves from our native tongues, whatever it might be. We translate ourselves into this outside language, which is English. So we too are translators, but of a very, very different, of a very different kind, in a different direction. And I think that both these situations, linguistic situations, I think, hint towards the condition of violence, really, that characterizes the 20th century. Also, how deeply sort of divided many of us are from our own linguistic situations, and where translation really becomes the condition, in some ways, of the poet. And so, in that sense, too, for me, Salan is a fascinating poet, because he really, I mean, in as much as he is talking, in as much as he's responding to the Holocaust and to the destruction of language after the Holocaust, he's also really charting a path for poets in other languages, I believe. The poem that I'm going to read, also, gives us a sense of how, for Salan, he really is trying to go beyond the human into perhaps sometimes the inorganic world or the natural world, and into a kind of understanding of the universe as cosmos. I think the word cosmos, I'm not sure, Achia, maybe you can help me with this, but I know that it exists in Greek, but I don't know if the same word actually exists in Hebrew as well.
So no, not in Hebrew. Not in Hebrew.
Yeah, okay.
We use it now, but it is borrowed, of course, from Greek.
Mm-hmm. So, so for him, he's really moving beyond this understanding of world, rather, to an understanding of, cosmic order, cosmological sort of order, in which especially after his reading of, the studies on Jewish mysticism by Gershom Scholem, where, the entire cosmos really becomes a kind of body of God itself, and all the parts of the cosmos really are, connected in ways that can perhaps be, discovered through mystic study. So he's reaching beyond the world of humans to sort of find answers to this question of language itself, and in that reaching out beyond the world of humans, also is there's one more point that I want to mention is, the question of breath. He says in the in that speech where he accepted the Bremen Prize, that poetry is an Atemwende, or he says poetry is a turn of breath. So for him, really, a poem is that which really turns, or affects the turning of the breath inside the reader, and that for him really constitutes the change that might be possible in the field of language. So I'll just read out this poem and then maybe talk a little bit about it. All souls. What did I do? Seminated the night, as though there could be others more nocturnal than this one. Bird flight, stone flight, 1,000 described routes. Glances purloined and plucked. The sea tasted, drunk away, dreamed away. An hour soul eclipsed. The next, an autumn light offered up to a blind feeling which came that way. Others, many, with no place but their own heavy centers, glimpsed and avoided. Foundlings, stars, black, full of language, named after an oath with silence annulled. And once, when, that too is forgotten, felt the barb where my pulse dared the counter beat. So this poem could be read as a poem about creation of the poem itself, and so he uses the metaphor of semination there, but he's also talking about seminating the night and not the day. Sort of the night of despair. This is also a poem, titled All Souls, which is a day of commemorating the dead, and sort of appeasing the pain that they might have gone through. So it's, in remembering, there's sort of like there's a remembering, and at the same time as there's a remembering of these souls, there's also a kind of dismembering that takes place, because after the speaker sort of seminates the night, what you see is like a whole lot of things that are a whole lot of quote unquote things that come out. There's birds, there's stones, there's glances. The hour itself is, time itself is somehow, emptied of a kind of presence, and our soul eclipsed. And then foundling stars, full of language. So, I mean, the stars, which stars and stones, they sort of figure prominently in his poems, which are full of language. They are named after an oath which silence annulled. I mean, that's very interesting to me, because silence has already cancelled an oath. An oath is a kind of, you make a promise to do something or to keep your word. So already that oath, which has been made in speech, by speaking, it has been annulled by silence. So there's already a sense of how it's the very sort of deteriorating content of language that actually makes possible the naming of these these newborn orphaned stars which are full of language, right? So it's this state of disintegration, despair, um, deterioration that actually makes possible it's in and through all of those um, situations that these foundlings which are full of language emerge. And in that moment, what I find most interesting about this poem is that he says, I felt the barb where my pulse dared the town to beat. So if the pulse moves in a particular direction, which is of course the direction of life, we have blood coursing through our veins, the counter beat for him is really that which moves against the usual current. And so for him also, the creation of the poem, the discovery of language which is named after an oath with silence annulled, is also a discovery or an assertion of a counterbeat in the blood, in the pulse itself, which is a beat against against all that has been prescribed, given in life, in breath, in being. So his poem, yeah.
Sorry, we don't want to miss on your poem. We are running out of time.
I'm sorry, I got carried away.
I'm sorry. Read your next poem because it's so powerful. So
no, sorry, Achia. I'll just finish this. Sorry. So for me, I think really Achia is, as my friend Timothy Levins, who who's a wonderful philosopher, he says Salan is a poet of freedom. In actually asserting that when he talks about this counter beat, a freedom which is one, which is hard won, by actually excavating excavating the the deepest recesses of corruption that language has been exposed to. So I mean, yeah, I can sort of read my poem as well. Post this. I'm inspired by Salan, and I think what I've learned from what I am learning, and what I have learned from his poems is this aspect of negation. Okay, my poem is titled Absence. A careful abiding, torn from the grown fire stalks, rests on the new tabletop. Wherever I turn, the sun moves further away. Reticence is not for the evening bird, faithful register of your absence, finally absent.
Aishwarya, thank you so much. Do you want to say
You're
something
welcome.
about your poem, or you're refusing still?
I don't know. I mean, maybe do you have something to say about it, Achia?
No, I mean, I
as a reader, I mean, I don't want to.
Maybe
I think
we
this
should and talk about it in the question answer session.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah,
that's a good idea. Okay, I thank you so much, Aishwarya. It was such a rich presentation. I just want to touch very, very quickly 2 points. First of all, you spoke about Adorno famously said that it is impossible to write poetry after Auschwitz. And paraphrasing on what you said after Celan, it seems that the only thing that you can do after Auschwitz is to write poetry. That's the only thing which is left, is language. So I thought that's interesting. Also, the notion of the artist, I would say, not only the poet, as a translator. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very interesting to compare this to the modernist, but more accurately to the romantic notion of the poet as the one who is expressing, as the one who is bringing his inner world outside in such a smooth and powerful way. And here we see with again, a powerful poet that maybe we can see his poetry as a translation. Thank you so much, Eshvarya. And now we are moving on to Geeta Patel. Very happy to have Geeta here. Geeta will speak about Miraji, and she's an expert on Miraji. I don't know any better expert. So I'm very, very glad that she's here. And I'm going again to start with the question, so I'm going to read it out. Geeta, Miraji is usually considered to be a modernist or even a formalist who didn't engage much with politics. Despite his relation with the progressive writers movement, an organization that was committed to the social cause or social causes, many of its members, many of the progressive, detested Miraji, correct me if I'm wrong, not only because of his bohemian and unusual lifestyle, but also for the lack of political commitment of his poetry. In the last 2 decades, various scholars, such as the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, underscored in various ways the politics of aesthetics. Similarly, I would say, in your study of Miraji, you don't only argue that his poetry was politically committed, I don't have a better expression, but that it should be seen as part of the project of decolonization. So I'm fascinated by this idea, and I'm looking forward to hear what you say about this. Thank you, Geeta.
Okay, thank you everyone who arranged this. Linika, Alitika, Helen, Achia for pulling me into it, my fellow brilliant participants and our audience. I ask you to forgive lapses. I'm jet lagged after traveling for 3 days. For the past almost 3 months, I was stuck in South India in Chennai, where I had gone to work in the archives for 5 days. There, I found myself unexpectedly getting involved because of 2 amazing poet friends, Ananya and Srilata. I was staying with Ananya, writing a daily Riyaz blog of 1 poem or translation a day for 30 days. And equally unexpectedly, be doing translations, inspired as though I was being sent them, almost funneling them through my fingers. I also began to compose my own poetry in response, writing through translation. And perhaps writing through translation is also true of Miraji, as it is perhaps for Salan, as Eshvarya has pointed out. The poet I was translating, and for those of you who know him, and Achia certainly does, is an Urdu poet, Sanaullah Dar, who took Miraji as his pen name, someone I've been working on since the 1980s, and I was asked to work on it by somebody called Shamsur Rahman Faruqi. For this brief talk, I'll read one of a few verses from his very well-known ghazal, Nagari Nagari Pira Musafir, which is his most frequently sung ghazal by Ghulam Ali, and it's also the film Manto's music video. And it's one of the ghazals I've translated from Miraji's extensive oeuvre, but I will start with a poem of mine that was written immediately after I translated one of his most sort of trenchant philosophical poems called Yaganagat, or Solitude. So I'll start with reading and then I'll talk. This is mine, Forest of Mourning. I sensed that trees clasped memories, bits and pieces of so many lives lingering along stem, littering the soft earth, mashed into the absent fall of leaves. But when I found them cradling, the staccato of a child's heels rising and falling away, an abrupt knife closing in on a heart that day in Missitook, I couldn't have known that soundlessness, no birds whose whisper flight, no flowers whose slow bow, might trace the spoor of death after death, as silence, so hollowed out, so utterly empty. Now Miraji. Wandering from town to house, a wayfarer misplaces the road that gathers him home. That which was once mine and your belongings, both forsworn from memory, mine and yours, no longer known. Wandering from town to house, a wayfarer misplaces the road that gathers him home. The world that has passed by has waned, as my heart annulled my life, as my heart annulled my life. I paid out my lot in laughter and forgot to mourn, to grieve. As I turn to look at everyone passing by, I find they all nurse one simple reproach. Why, when I can recall everything so fully, why, when I can recall everything so fully, has my time forgotten me? And the final verse, in which the poet announces his name, should someone ask you about that poet who persuaded you to give up your heart, should someone ask you about the poet who persuaded you to give up your heart, tell them this, that having spoken, Miraji repented. Having spoken, Miraji repented and then mislaid his voice. Who was Miraji? Miraji, 1912 to 1949, he died when he was 37, is probably one of the best modernist poets in any Indian language, partly because he was so promiscuous in trying out new forms of lyric as well as prose. He translated voraciously from pretty much every Indian language, including Sanskrit, and given his name, was translating the poet, Bhakti poet Mirabai, as he died. He also translated widely from poets all over the world, and that included Salan, as well as from many different eras, including his own time. And he translated Anna Akhmatova, H.D., Cummings, Gertrude Stein. But his focus was often on poets who'd been exiled over and over from literary canyons, or consigned to the garbage bins of history, then dusted off and revived, dumped again, or simply poets who'd been misplaced and forgotten. Here we can include among many others, he wrote essays on Japanese women poets, Sappho, Korean women poets, Charles Baudelaire. Translation for him, to paraphrase Aishwarya, was the condition of lyric itself. When he translated these poets in his essays and in other places, his voice became theirs, and theirs began to shift into his. It was as though he channeled them, became a medium for them, in the same way he became a medium for me. He spoke them, they spoke through him. Miraji was self-taught, his schooling was in libraries. He felt we needed to usher back those who'd been left out of our textbooks as an antidote to colonial holes in our sense of what mattered and on the compass of our imaginations. He believed we could repair the grief that colonialism left when it abraded our tongues by turning to poetry, and not just through what we wrote, but how we wrote. He settled for a time in many places. He was a musafir, a traveler, but the cities in which he began to find his craft and his practice of poetry, he built circles or halkas, assemblies or jamaat, and they were in Lahore, Delhi, and Bombay, where he died on the electroshock therapy table. It was considered, he's known as an extraordinarily generous, subtle, tender reader, and as an essayist whose musings on other poets changed the entire form of the essay on lyric, or the lyrical essay. The Progressive Writers Association, as Achia knows, didn't know what to do with him. They called him insane, kept on tossing him out, but he refused to leave and kept on coming back. It was considered an honor at the time to have him agree to write on your lyric. Faiz Ahmed Faiz, among the many poets, mailed verse to Miraji and asked for an essay. And he introduced the recitation of contemporary poetry and forays into essayistic translations to All India Radio Delhi, where he worked for a short while. He lived like a sadhu or a Sufi, few clothes, a thela or a bag of papers, folders calligraphed with his own lyric, giving everything he'd earned. He drank every day, but only in the evenings, every day, all day until 5. Before he began to drink, he was absorbed in the riyaz of crafting lyric. Achia has asked me what's particularly political, where the political is in Miraji's poetry. He's known as a formalist and heralded as a master of the formal, and his lyric is supposed to be devoid of any political nuance or content. But he wrote in the crucible of anti-colonial movements that were rampant, expanding, overtaking South Asia during his very brief life. For his compatriots, politics was regulated by content, what he wrote, the topics on which he ventured to compose. For Miraji, politics was not there, but in how you wrote, what each sentence, phrase, metaphor portended. Why? Colonial education policy in the 19th century was focused on transmuting lyric. I mean, they understood very well that poetry mattered, changing the language of lyric to suit a more realist rather than a heavily metaphorical form. And in the process, poets, especially in Urdu, were expected to forego their lineages and their forebearers. Miraji believed very strongly that this loss, which also evacuated metaphysics and philosophy from metaphor, left a melancholic residue. And as a result, 19th and 20th century poets forgo the paths that their forebearers had wended to lead them to compose, and so lost their way. The British made, in this education system they installed, they made what we now consider our own languages. So I would say to Aishwarya, it's not just English that's foreign. It's what they made was, and they called vernacular. What they made was the vernacular. And these languages were supposed to be shorn of their own lyrical histories. They were supposed to be written in sentences to serve those who served. The phrasing, the grammar, the semiology of accounts, of the record, technocrats, of bare mechanistic labor. The push was to technical education. The push was to techno-talk. Sadharan Bhasha, Mamuli Zaban is how we would call it. Bhavani Raman writes about this in a monograph on Tamil called Document Raj. And for one of the poets, Altaf Hussain Hali, writing at the time, he went to what he called natural shairi with this sort of simple language, right? This language that's shorn as far as it can be of the metaphorical and the metaphysical. So Miraji returned around the time that the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein was writing about ordinary language to everyday speech and turned that speech into lyric philosophy. The political work he did is a rejuvenation of what had been taken from you. Lost language or lost tongue for indigenous folk, for example, in the US. So for it, you go to the place you've been asked to denude, to deplete of all nuance and reinvest it, reinvigorate it, make it flourish and dance as metaphor and philosophy. To take what's been handed to you, the thing in which you've been imprisoned, the commonplace sentence, and make it something else. And one commonplace sentence is Nagari Nagari Pira Musafir, the traveler who goes from town to town. It's a very, very, very quotidian sentence. The sentence is anchored to the physical, but it floats out and is grounded in the metaphysical, so that it can be haunted again by the teachers you're expected to toss, and new ones that had been tossed out by others. And for me, this is why the title of my book is called Historical Hauntings and Lyrical Movements. It's about the historical as a haunting that haunts the language that's been taken from you. And for me, lyrical movements is also traveling between these different poetic registers and parts, but it's also political. It's a political movement. Only through that, Miraji felt, could poets find their voice. They wandered from town to town, which is an allegory for different poetic homes and lineages. You forgot what is yours, and you will forget, and you should forget what is yours, because what you've been given as yours has lost you your voice. And by dropping what is yours, you find yourself in another's via translation. You refuse to belong to where you're forced to settle. But these, as most people know, Ghazal is also Sufi. It's a relation between selves. And again, I go back to Aishwarya and Salan. And by the way, as I was writing the dissertation and the book, I was working with German poets who were working on both. And I said this to Aishwarya, Bachmann and Salan, who sort of wrote with one another, to really think about what poetry did, right? So you reinvent the native yourself as a foreigner, and you reinvent the foreign as native. So I would say that someone is political in a way that's, you sort of produce political edginess through what's considered non-political. And for Miraji, what would you call him but political? Because he asks us to think of Sappho as our teacher and our guide, our funky didactic lodestone, our guide through fascism because of her stances on fascism. Even as when he, in his essay on Sappho, Miraji was asking his fellow lyricists to enter her desire for women, to feel hamdardi, grief and oneness with her joys and losses. So, and I think for me, and I'll close with this, I picked A Forest of Mourning because it's both literal and allegorical. It's time folded into memory. It's trauma in the visual metaphor of the forest, the landscape with its voice lost. I ask in it where and with whom the silence lie. Trauma's in the silence, and it is the silence. It's the voice mislaid, found in the silences between phrasing and music. And this is where the philosophical and the metaphysical is to be found. Silence breathes metaphor into life. And should someone ask you about the poet who persuaded you to give up your heart, tell them this, that having spoken, Miraji repented and then mislaid his voice. And I'm done. And we can go to questions or other things after. Achia, your sound is off. Yeah. You've muted yourself again.
No, I'm doing nothing.
Okay.
Someone else is controlling me. Okay. Thank you so much, Geeta. It was really enriching, and well, there is a lot to get from this. And thank you to all the panelists for creating such a poetic session, for a lack of a better word. And now, as Geeta said, we are going to open this for Q&A, which I think Helen is taking care of. Helen?
Yeah. Achia,
Yeah.
the question is, and Helen has asked the question, it's if you were to compare Miraji to a visual artist, who would that be?
That's an interesting question. You know, it's interesting. I would say, I don't know if you know the work of Shiba Chachi. I would say two artists. I'd say Achia Anzi and Shiba Chachi. And I think, you know, for one, do you know that Achia curated a show on Miraji? So partly, I think because the installation that I actually asked him to show us at the beginning, I think of the poems, the one of the versions of the installation, because there's several, I think of the poems as put into crypts, you know, and actually it's interesting because Miraji, one of the things that Miraji does is asks you to return as you're reading into the somatic. You don't understand Miraji, and that's true for my writing until you read it aloud. And the reason why I like the one of the Achia's installations, and I think the Shiba's installations do that too, is they ask you for different registers of the visual that actually sound out silence, but they also ask you to make your body do the work of imagination, right? So at its best, installation is a somatic event. And for Miraji, reading was a somatic event. For me, I mean, writing, as I said, even when I write prose, it's somatic. So I'd say, for me, those two artists in particular.
That's such a wonderful answer. And I think it also speaks to that political edge that you're describing, that by the silence, evoking the silence or taking away the silence, we're dealing with something Ashwari said about poetry is violent or can be. So I thank you. That's a wonderful answer.
And you know, Rick's visuals, like the beauty of what he's done, right? I think those two demand the same thing. They ask your body to work.
Yes.
Right? You don't have to speak. You literally move the body into the page.
It's funny you say that, Geeta, because this is just one of 18 spreads, but a lot of them have, well, first of all, each one is in a triptych that has to be opened like a window, right? Or the way in which you open a poem. But a lot of them have curtains that hide other images. So kind of playing with what's seen and what's not seen, or, you know, I blind emboss a lot of things. So blind emboss is printing without ink. And so you have to really look to see what's there or what's not there. And it's a very, you know, the interior paper is very soft like velvet, and yet around that is this handmade paper that's a rough kind of like Jerusalem stone. So I think very much, yeah.
I wanted to say something about what Geeta said, not about me. And in fact, I'm a huge fan of Geeta before we even met. I translated Miraji years back, and one of the scholars that one had to read if one wants to know something about Miraji is, of course, Geeta. So yeah, and later we met, and also that was very exciting. And so what was interesting in what Geeta said, in fact, when I was going quickly to think about a visual artist from the time of Miraji, and I couldn't think about anyone. And it is interesting that she's going to Shiba Chachi, who is an excellent artist. And I think that, and I think there is something about it. Miraji was highly educated, well-versed, very controversial. And I think this led to his death. Stories about him are crazy. You read them and you don't get if the person was actually insane. So it's interesting. I think that it's interesting to note that Geeta decided to compare him not to the modernist, not to the progressive of the 1940s, but to someone contemporary as Shiba Chachi. So wanted to know that.
Yeah. Do you need me to say something about that? Or is it just like...
We need to take more questions if we have, I don't know.
I think so, because we should, yeah.
So I think Helen's was the last question. It's, yeah, that was the only question also. So maybe if you could check the FB Live and maybe you all can sort of engage with any questions that come up in the longer run.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
You know, this has been fabulous.
Are there any questions on FB Live?
Sana, are there any questions on FB Live?
No, they aren't.
I think this is the kind of sessions that you have to take in and process slowly. So that's good.
Yeah. It's very complex. It's very complex. I mean, all the poets are really, you know, nuanced and philosophically, you know, delicate in a way. And then, I mean, all the, you know, the registers that you raised, you know, I mean, I think you raised, Achia, and then all of us raised, right? Actually, you have to actually, like I was thinking about, you know, what you said, Rick, about a poem that's a lullaby to calm yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, it's really interesting because even like there's something about the form of the lullaby, which is a body sound. The lullaby works because it's sounded through the body. You know, there's a, and I was thinking about prayer, both, you know, when you're reciting the Torah, right? You're moving. It's true of Urdu and Sanskrit. Learned Vedic. I had to learn Vedic through the body. You don't learn classical Sanskrit mathematically with your head, but Vedic is very hard for a lot of people because you learn it the way you learn the Torah. You learn it through the body. You learn the rhythms of it. And the same thing with Urdu. You learn it through the meter, right? The metrical feeling is the music of the body. And so in that, it lulls, it doesn't just lull your body, it ignites the somatic imagination. It's really interesting, you know.
I think Hamakai had something he was talking about once when, like, when a mother is reciting or singing, some of these folk tales or whatever would have some, difficult or even, very violent things, but it's coming from a mother, right? And maybe she's singing a lullaby, and so it's all couched within this type of a thing where you're hearing one thing intellectually, and yet emotionally you're getting this reassurance, right? There's this kind of bodily presence, exchange between people, and
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, would you say, because I was also thinking about, like, writing in Hebrew, for example. Hebrew becomes a language for some people that they learn as another. I mean, some people grow up learning Hebrew from very little, right? It's your first language, but for a lot of people, Hebrew is another language, right? You're speaking in multiple registers. I mean, the way in South Asia, a lot of people who speak Farsi also know Urdu or know Gujarati, or people who do Sanskrit also know other languages. So it's like, it's interesting. So I was thinking of Celan as well, right? So we are so bound, and I think it's a fantasy of the nationalist state to the idea that our lives are only in one language. And I think what's interesting about all of us, I mean, not just the poets we write about or think about, but all of us, we are all living in multiple languages, as was Wittgenstein, right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking of the ordinary language philosopher who was living both in Viennese German, was Jewish, and living in English, right? And he's the person who writes about ordinary language, So I don't know if Adorno, Frankfurt School, does do that, but not in the same way. There's some more. There's a difference between the Frankfurt School and Benjamin, for example, that's really profound, right? Benjamin understands the language of mysticism, for example, in a way.
Yeah, something that the rest of the Frankfurt School will never do.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say something, especially when Rick mentioned about Yehuda Hamakai, who thought of poetry as a lullaby, and the comforting aspect, the aspect of poetry that can console. Poetry as consolation, poetry as marham, poetry as sort of cure for for the ailment of sort of living in a tortured modernity. I don't think that Celan is really going very far away from this. I mean, for him, I don't think poetry offers any consolation. And he is actually not also interested in, sort of consoling the reader. I think in that sense, it's actually hard for me to understand. He really is trying to, and in that sense, I go back to what Rick was saying, which is that there is some kind of a quarrel here too with God, even though he was a non-believer and remained a non-believer until the end. Sort of, it's a kind of, raising your hand or raising your existence, against the idea of God itself, and trying to find out, is there anything sort of at all that can tell me that things will be okay, or that things can somehow go back to normal. So in that sense, he certainly, I think so. I mean, maybe Geeta would have something else to say in response, but I don't think that, there's absolutely no aspect of poetry as, as comfort, consolation, lullaby in Celan.
I agree, actually. I don't think Celan does a lullaby. And interestingly enough, what I was thinking was Rick's second poem, right? What the hell was God doing on that seventh day?
Yeah.
That in a way is closer to Salan. You know what I mean? I was thinking, as you read it and then you started talking about Salan, it was a great
segue.
So if I
segue,
question,
Yeah.
I pose it. The question is, I wonder, well, there's two questions. First is, I wonder about Miraji's mental health. The word insanity is not accurate. What is the understanding at this point about his diagnosis? And what role does Geeta think about the role of his mental illness affecting his poetry? And then for all of you, I also wonder what they each think about the importance of reading poetry from different cultures in terms of better understanding of the human condition. So Geeta, if you can answer the first, and the second is open to all of you.
So I'll answer the first and as well as the second and then hand it over. Well, I don't think Miraji was insane. I do think that his body broke down. And I mean, I've spent a lot of time talking to people. I think insanity is something people use when they don't know what to do with a poet. So I actually think, but I do think he lived like a Sufi. I mean, that's one of the things that Manto was trying to struggle with him. And if you want to call a Sufi insane, you are. I mean, when you touch the divine in a way that you know you're not of the earth. So I'd say he wasn't of the earth in a simple way. And what I will say about Miraji is that he really, for him, the only way that you could find your way back to voice was to actually go to the poets, to go to poets from other places. So Miraji was, and certainly for me, it's the same thing for me. I learned who to be and how to be and be political through going to other places and other poets. And Miraji was my teacher in that, actually, because I started reading him when I was, 20. I was young. I was a baby. So.
And the second.
Does that help?
Yes, very much so. I mean, he was an ecstatic, is what you're saying.
Yes, he was a mystic. Yeah, he was a modernist mystic.
About the importance of reading poetry from different cultures in terms of better understanding the human condition. This comes from Shanti Nars. Would anyone like to answer that, please?
I would like to say something. For me, means, yes, there is obviously importance of, that's a great way of knowing another culture. I think for me, coming to know Urdu poetry, for example, it was not only about translating, understanding the meaning. There is a whole culture around Urdu poetry. And I think the way Geeta read today, the ghazal of Miraji, was also made in that way. Those who knows Urdu ghazal would recognize it in her translation, the way that she was reciting. It was very specific to Urdu poetry. But I mean, so that's one way of answering the question. The other point, I always feel that there is something problematic. Problematic when I'm reading a poetry, either not in my own language or translated, or a language that I didn't go deep into. So if I could understand Urdu at some point through translation, dictionary, so it took me a while to understand many more things about it, or to be affected, to understand the effect that those poems might have. And I think that despite the fact that modern Hebrew poetry is not as rich maybe as German or English poetry, etc., there is always something about going back to my mother tongue, and poetry in my mother tongue, or even translation, is always for me far more powerful, far more. The impact is much stronger.
I would say, I think that people often talk about what's lost in translation, but I think you can flip the coin there also and say what's gained in translation. And I think it's a whole world. I mean, no, it's clearly not the original, and you don't have all the connotations and the context of the words of the original, and yet you do get a glimpse into another way of seeing the world or thinking about the world or thinking about language in itself. So, I think it's essential to read other poets in whatever language they might write in.
I think, can I say something?
Sure.
I think that more than just reading poetry in one's own language or in other languages, I think what I perhaps learned from Salan also is something that's become very, very difficult in our own times, is actually to use language poetically, not necessarily in a poem, but all the time, which is how do we actually resist the encrustations, which are constantly being pushed upon us, by the world, the media, political speech, ideologies, sort of consumption, capitalism, all of that, and reclaim language as something that actually belongs to us and something to which we belong in a more, in a more sort of like, I think that is something that has become very, very difficult, where we can recover that connection and recover that connection so that we don't just learn about other cultures, but we also become more attuned to, to our own sort of condition as beings, as creatures, all of that.
So can I add to that? Actually, the thing for Miraji, I think the lesson he taught me was exactly that, which is sort of what I said at the beginning, which is that actually we find ourselves through another. That in fact, and it's very much like, the task of the translator, Walter Benjamin, that the task of the translator is not to render something else in one's own language, but to actually transform one's language as one renders. And for Miraji, finding his own tongue again required him to go elsewhere, right? So it was only through, and it's, as Aishwarya says, to find literally how one's being, one has to go elsewhere. And if the elsewhere provides a place for a home for being in a way, so.
I think if we have no more questions, Helen, we can wrap up.
Yes, beautiful panelists. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, Helen.
Achia, I just, sorry, as true to the academic convention, I just wanted to say that whatever I had said about the cosmos in Salan, I was basically sort of referring to Rochelle Tobias's book, The Discourse of Nature and the Poetry of Paul Celan. So I just wanted to put that citation out there. Sorry, you can go ahead. Yeah.
And can we go off Facebook Live and just talk within ourselves for about 5 minutes or so? Just to
the host should
tell. Yes, so we are going to thank all of you. Thank you so much for being on this panel. I'm going to close FB Live and I'm going to let you all converse.
Okay. All right.